I know the wind is going to be terrible, and I don't feel like screaming at all the people around me, so this is just going to have terrible audio quality. I did want to make a video about Genesis, and the crux of the story for me is this question of the knowledge of good and evil. And what does that mean? What does it mean to have knowledge of good and evil? You know, God in Genesis gives commandments to Adam. He says, Adam, you know, these things are good. He says fruit is good and the animals are good, and he teaches Adam what's good. And Adam gains a certain level of wisdom and knowledge. In fact, he's able to name the animals, right? So, and some people even say, I think there's certain Mishnah or Jewish commentary that says, you know, God wasn't capable, or not God, but that Satan, Lucifer, was not capable of the creative genius necessary to name the animals. Lucifer couldn't do that. It was up to Adam, the first man, to do that. Only he had that creativity. So clearly Adam has some level of knowledge. He has some level of thinking ability. But then what does it mean that he gains knowledge of good and evil? If he knows, for instance, not to eat of the tree, and eating of the tree is therefore evil, well, then it would seem that he already has knowledge of good and evil. And so my argument is that when Genesis says knowledge of good and evil, it's not talking about the mere content or substance of the knowledge in itself. But really, it's talking about knowledge of the substrate, or knowledge of what is behind good and evil, I suppose. Like, it's one thing to memorize numbers like 2, 4, 6, 8, and you can repeat those back to me, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. And I could have you memorize a string of commandments, a string of numbers, a string of information, and you would have that information. But I think what it means by knowledge of good and evil is not to merely have a string of information containing commandments of what is good and evil. But knowledge of good and evil is really a philosophy of good and evil. And, you know, the events taking place with Adam are supposed to be 6,000 years old. People disagree with that. But, I mean, the text, the story, is at least multiple thousands of years old, 2,000 to 3,000 years old, and probably has predecessors going back further. Perhaps that old or even older. We don't know, because it goes into oral tradition at some point. You know, what's remarkable about Judaism is the fact that they write everything down. Zoroastrianism clearly is a predecessor for that, but that's a marked difference from the oral cultures that dominate. Even while you had the written word, the mythos of religion was not often written down, and in the Egyptian case it was hieroglyphic, it was pictorial, it was artistic, in a way that a Jewish alphabet is not, or Avestin, which is related to Sanskrit, the Rig Veda, and so on. In any case, to get back on track here, with regard to the knowledge of good and evil, I think it's really saying a philosophy of good and evil. I think really to have knowledge of good is to say this is good. To have knowledge of evil says this and good. But to say this is evil, right? but to say knowledge of good and evil, it is to have knowledge of a deeper question, maybe not even to have the answer to that question, but just to know that there is a deep question here, which is, what makes things good? What makes things evil? What is the root of good and evil? What's the syntax that binds good and evil together? What's the difference between good and evil? Who decides? Who is the arbitrator, or what is the arbitrator? And really the question that we get is that Epicurean question, what makes God good? If God is the good, if he's synonymous with the good, then he has no will independent from the good. But if God has no will independent from the good, then he has no free will, then he's bound by the good. And if God is bound by the good, then he's not really a free agent. He doesn't have freedom. So it's like he either has total goodness and is bound by that, or he has total freedom, and therefore the concept of the good is defined by him, and the concept of the good is arbitrary. So you could say this is like moral realism versus moral nominalism, or moral nihilism, or moral relativism, however you want to frame that. But this is like a really difficult question, and it calls into question all of religion. And so there's two dynamics here, or two ways to look at that. On the one hand, you can say that Adam is questioning the knowledge of good and evil, he's really questioning the nature of God. And for God, that's very... And it says in Genesis that should he live forever, he would become as us, he would become as gods, implying that, and the term there is Elohim, which, monotheists will claim that Elohim means it's the royal we. I'm not so certain about that. But in any case, it implies that to be a god means to have knowledge of good and evil. To be a god means to be able to ask these sorts of questions, these philosophical questions. What is the nature of morality? Can we get up above morality and look down on it rather than simply being submerged in it? At the beginning of Genesis, it says that God, the Spirit of God, moved upon the waters. And here I think, to me, one of the metaphors implicit there is that the waters are this submergence within a field of reality. That some things are good, some things are bad, and you just kind of take it for granted. But once you are able to get above that field of reality, you're able to criticize it and say, what really is the nature of morality? Then you sort of become as a god. And that is scary to the existing gods. Now, there is a Marxist, atheistic, or even class-based interpretation, Nietzschean interpretation, all of these, biblical skeptics, or whatever you would call them, they say, let's assume for a moment that when it says the Elohim and it says Yahweh, it's not really talking about those entities in a literal sense, but metaphorically, the message is, don't question the system of morality, or the priest class will kick you out of the garden. That's one way of interpreting it. Another way of interpreting it is that when we are in a state of philosophical ignorance, when we're in a state of bliss, when we simply accept that what is good and what is bad, and we don't try to gain knowledge of the difference between the good and the bad, we don't try to gain this superordaining wisdom that we're able to determine what is good and bad, we merely accept it as given. That this is basically an animal state. This is the state of pleasure and pain, that some things are pleasurable, some things are painful. You go toward pleasure, you flee from pain. Life is pleasurable, death is painful. And so It gives you an Edenic state. It gives you a kind of freedom from suffering, the kind of suffering that comes from one who seeks this knowledge, becomes confounded by this knowledge which leads to a form of confusion and suffering which is not known to animals. This question of what is the meaning of life? Why am I here? These questions are deeply troubling and even depressing, and they are, I think, represented metaphorically by the kicking out of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. For seeking this knowledge, they are kicked out of the garden. What does that mean? It means that when we reject a simple moral realism or an instinctual view of reality, or I would even say a pagan view of reality, this is when Adam and Eve move on from being pagans to being atheists, and they say, we want to know why is the good good and why is the bad bad, that this creates nihilism. And metaphorically, this is like going from a perfect garden where everything is natural and everything is normal and everything is well kept and makes sense, it's coherent, and now you're kicked out into toiling and suffering. I think this is almost, to me, Genesis is like an anti-Gnostic myth. Gnostic Christianity says that the material world is evil, and that what you really want to do is you want to escape the material world through gnosis. You want to gain a certain level of knowledge and wisdom so that you can escape the material world. Buddhism already also has this to an extent, although you could say on a deeper level, Buddhism is anti-Gnostic because it sort of rejects these categories of knowledge and science and whatever in favor of total nothingness and a return to animal nature in one way or another, that the simpler consciousness of the animal is in some way superior to this suffering of the human who has knowledge of good and evil. So I think Buddhism addresses this in a paradoxical way, which is interesting to say the least. I'm not sure that it is true or not something really I practice on a daily basis, but I think we should be aware of it, that Buddhism is trying to confront in many ways similar questions and coming up with radically different answers. But the throwing out from the garden, what is that then addressed by? In Judaism and in Christianity, there is some process of reconciliation, of getting back to Adam. And for Jews, it's if we follow the law, then eventually we will be resurrected. Eventually, we could be like Elijah. We could be summoned up to heaven. You can look at the connection between the Buddhist and the Hindu, where there is reincarnation. You're going up the chain. The Kabbalah has a concept of reincarnation. So there's this idea of, yes, we've been thrown out of the garden for our disobedience, our desire to know more. The Faustian spirit has led us to question the knowledge of good and evil, but we can escape that. We can escape this fallen world, and we can return to a perfect world through obedience to the law. In Christianity, it basically says that's impossible because the sin, it's much easier to sin than it is to be redeemed, and the nature of God is perfect, and to sin against God, a perfect God, there's a concept of infinity implicit here, that to sin against God is infinitely bad. It's not simply, oh, you made an accident, okay, well, pay God $5 and you'll be, you can't repay that debt. This is the concept implicit in Christianity, which I think comes about as a result of Judaism being quite strict with regard to intermarriage, and the fact that early Christian figures like Timothy and the people of Galilee were the product of intermarriage. And so if, your dad is Jewish and your mom is a Gentile or vice versa, and you're going to synagogue or you're growing up in a semi-Jewish culture and you're aware of the idea of Judaism, you're aware of the idea that you should not mix with the unclean foreigner and whatnot, and you're the product of that, then it's kind of like you're born into a fallen state and there's no way that you can be redeemed, and you're in this perfect state of depravity, completely separate from God, completely separate from God's people and God's kingdom. But you long to return to it. You long to be grafted on. You want to be a branch grafted onto the tree of Israel. And so I think that is a huge incentive for the development of Christianity, is to solve this problem of sin that you were born into, which you cannot control. There's nothing you can do to atone for it. You can never change your, if your heritage is a sin, there's really nothing you can do to atone for that heritage, because it wasn't even a choice that you made. You're just born in this unclean state. And so Christ comes and he says, it is not what goes into you that makes you unclean, it's what comes out of you that makes you unclean. And essentially there he's making the distinction between sins a priori and a posteriori, saying that the circumstances into which you were born, your ethnic status, your heritage, that does not make you unclean. What makes you unclean is what you do with it, how you live your life, the choices that you make. And in that, he offers a path to redemption. We still, I guess, have this problem if we don't want to submit to an arbitrary concept of good and evil, because going back to the Marxist, Nietzschean, materialist analysis, whoever you want to reference here, Bruno Bauer, you still have this issue, you still have this problem where it's like, okay, God, are you good? If you're good, then can you do whatever you want? And if you can do whatever you want, can you do things that are not good? And this fundamental problem, the problem of arbitration, what binds God? If God is not bounded, then God is arbitrary. And why call that which is arbitrary good? Judaism tried to solve this with adherence to the law, and said we're just going to kind of have it on blind faith that the law is good. And the law is in many ways arbitrary, right? I think Ben Shapiro at one point made an argument, I think on the Joe Rogan podcast, where he said he doesn't like it when people try to justify Jewish law according to modern science. He doesn't like it when people say, like, oh, well, 3,000 years ago, we didn't have refrigerators, and so pork contains a lot of parasites, and so that's why God banned the Jewish people from eating pork. And he says, no, that's not what Judaism is about. Judaism is not about, at least Orthodox Judaism, and I've spoken at length about secular Judaism in other videos, but in Orthodox Judaism, you don't follow the laws because they're logical. You don't follow them because they benefit you. You don't follow them because they make sense. You follow them because you love God, and you're willing to do whatever God tells you. And I think, the story of Abraham being commanded by the angel to sacrifice his son Isaac on an altar, human sacrifice, I think that is an example of exactly what Ben is talking about, where you say, this is arbitrary, I don't understand this, and it even seems sort of evil in a way to sacrifice one's own son. But it is nonetheless required of a good Hebrew, a good Yehudim. It is required to be faithful to the Lord to follow his commandments. And Christians say, basically, they take this and they say, look, the commandments have become a worship of a priest class. They've become the worship of the Pharisees, who reinterpret these commandments. God says respect the Sabbath, and now all of a sudden that's become this extremely complicated thing where you can do this, you can't do that, and then you have to hire a Shabbos goy to, now today it's with light switches and things. I'm sure it was less complicated back then. But still, they look at this and they say, this is not according to the original spirit of the commandment, that things have gotten out of hand, that, the original idea was to obey the Lord, Yahweh, your God, 100%. And now it seems as if people are not listening to the voice of the Lord. They're listening to, some huckster, some, bureaucrat, essentially. Tell them, oh, I talk to God and this is what he wants and I have the correct interpretation. And they saw people abusing that, and they saw people suffering. They saw a huge religious problem, and they tried to solve it by saying, yeah, we still need to be loyal to the Lord, but we're going to simplify the commands a little bit. We're not going to keep kosher anymore. We're not going to really regard any day as more special than another day. There's no prescription in the New Testament to, have Christmas, to celebrate the birth of Christ on December 25th. A lot of Christians do celebrate Easter or Passover, although I find that in our contemporary culture, Easter is probably one of the least celebrated days. And again, if you're a Christian, maybe that's different for you. But in any case, waves are getting pretty loud here. What I want to, so I don't want this to be too long, I just want to say that the problem of the knowledge of good and evil for Jews is solved with it's solved with obedience. And with Christians, I just got my pants all wet here. That was unfortunate. With Christians, it's also solved with obedience, but what Christians attempt to do is they attempt to push the reset button and say, we're the original Jews. It's just that Judaism has become too tied up in the law, in legalism, and attachment to a particular heritage, attachment to a particular place, that God is universal, that God is bigger than kosher laws. God is not, he's not interested in these particular little pedantic things. He's interested in the spirit of truth. And so there is like this, anti-nominal bent to Christianity in the specificity of Judaism, in the reaction to, okay, we have multiculturalism, we have the Roman Empire, Jews are living throughout the Roman Empire, they're mixing with Gentiles, they're producing a group of people who are very religiously confused at the same time that the rest of the Roman Empire is very atheistic. The belief in the old gods is waning, the belief in the Republic has been totally destroyed, I think with the death of Cicero being one of the last real republicans of Rome. So, and Roman government was always theological. There wasn't this huge distinction between the politics of Rome and the theology of Rome. That the gods justified Roman government, and this shift in Roman government seriously put into question the Roman religion. And so many people were atheistic. The populares, the mass populace, populi Romana Populi, they may have believed in the gods in a more traditional sense, but the upper class seemed to be much more cynical. And that didn't seem to work, to be honest. That did not seem to be a sustainable situation, to have this distinction between symbolic propaganda and real actual belief. I think Christianity has experienced the same thing in the modern day. So I've argued this before, that I think Christianity is experiencing a similar crisis to what Roman paganism experienced. And whereas Roman paganism was confronted with Christianity as an alternative, we are now being presented with wokeism, or whatever you want to call it, as an alternative. And there's a lot of parallels there. And so I think even Jews experienced this. I mean, I think these three religions started in revolutions. You know, wokeism started in this Enlightenment revolution or prior, you know, but I think of this as revolutionary activity, and that prior to the revolution that produced our current atheism, or whatever you would call it, we had sorry, give me a second here. Take a water break. Go take a water break. Pause the video, take a water break. We have the revolution of wokeism. We have the revolution of Christianity, and Judaism itself was revolutionary at the time, and I think distinctly a product of a multicultural mode where you had different city-states worshiping different gods, and the Jews, being composed of 12 different tribes, were struggling to figure out, how do we have a common mythological framework, given the fact that we are a nomadic, mercantile people who are constantly, you know, venturing around these different parts of the Middle East, going into different cities, encountering different gods, different theological systems. How do we maintain cohesion without dissolving? And I'm sure there were a lot of groups who, for instance, the Normans, the Franks, and so on, the Varangians, many groups historically have been migratory, culturally migratory, which has resulted in the dissolution of that particular identity. And the revolution there with Judaism was to figure out, how can we avoid that? How can we change that? How can we maintain ourselves? So I think all three of these come about in a state of large-scale confusion and suffering. And that is what Adam himself is confronting. He's confronting confusion and suffering. What is the nature of morality? By what standard do we call God God? By what standard do we call God good? What is the source of good and evil? Is it good to live? By what standard is it good to live? By what is the metric by which we say life is good? Because it is the nature of life in itself that has produced suffering. That our feelings of pain are a result of an evolutionary process that seeks to avoid death, and in doing so looks at our environment and looks at a berry and says, you know, if the berry is tasty, I'll remember that. I'll remember the berry is tasty. But if the berry is poisonous, if the berry is deathly, then I need to remember that 10 times more. That suffering, and Buddhism says suffering is due to attachment, but attachment is just part of life, right? And so the escapement from attachment, for them they say you reincarnate, so you can't just kill yourself, but you have to detach from life. So life is the origin of suffering. And this way of thinking drives people into antinatalism, that it's not good to live because life is the origin of suffering. And so how can God be good if he's created a world where life is suffering? I think, which also leads the Gnostics to say that God did not create the world, that it was the demiurge, and that the true God, the good God, is separate from the demiurgic materialist, who I think in Steiner's system would be associated, starts with an A. On the one hand, you have Lucifer, who is the Gnostic. Ahriman is the materialist in Steiner's system. So the Gnostics would say that Ahriman has created the universe and all life in the universe, and you should follow the path of Lucifer that says you need to be a Gnostic, you need to free yourself from these material attachments. But then the question becomes, why would God create Ahriman? Why would God create the demiurge? Being all-knowing, being all-powerful and whatnot, it still doesn't really explain the creation of these figures. And in those stories, it almost seems as if God is this kind of, he's sort of a victim. He was tricked, he fell asleep, and while he was sleeping, the demiurge came and made all this mess of life. But I'm really getting distracted here. I probably should have taken the alternate route. It's too much going on. This is going to be a long video because I'm not getting out my ideas very quickly or effectively. But I wonder if there's a way for me to return. I wish there was a pause button on this. There's no pause button. It's just stop and go. And I hate to take the time to edit. I guess ultimately we have to confront this ungroundedness. We have to confront the fact that our thinking about suffering is itself a cause of suffering. That to try to solve these problems through obedience to a certain law, to say this is good, this is bad, if you do it paganistically, if you do it according to your sensual whims and desires, we see how that very easily leads us astray. We see how established religions and dogmas, which attempt to recreate genetic instinct through abstraction, which they attempt to basically, we hunger for bread, and so religions attempt to create a Pavlovian response where we consider reading the Bible a nourishment and that we hunger for the Bible. But, there's an issue when these dogmas become so codified, they become so stultified and fossilized that they can't deal with religious revolutions, which is what we're going through now. And so they become dead. Christianity says that the law became dead. The law became like an old wineskin, and it was no longer fit for wine. You can't put new wine in old wineskins. You cannot put a spirit of life and living in an old system, a system that worked for a particular people, but did not work for, the progeny, the intermixed progeny of those people. So a new wineskin had to be developed, a new doctrine, a new religion. That's kind of where we find ourselves at right now, except, the attempt to just say, okay, well, we'll just invent a new religion or something. I mean, that is kind of wokeism, right? And obviously, people have their own issues with that. So, where does that leave us? How do we respond to this in-between moment where it's like, I think I pretty clearly made my case here. I don't know where people want to disagree or how they want to disagree. I think through maybe a type of historical ignorance, people want to argue from that position. And maybe for some people, they want to argue from the position of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, for a lot of people living in the Roman Empire in the Middle East, Roman paganism was not satisfactory. Judaism was not satisfactory. They needed something new. But I don't think really many people remained Roman pagans, although I don't think that faith entirely died, in the same way that I don't think Christianity is going to entirely die. I think Roman paganism and other forms of paganism lived on, and things like the Renaissance in the classical thinkers and philosophers. So, and art, there's many ways in which you can say it lived on. But, as a system, as a complete system with a coherent relationship between a priest class and a mass of people, Roman paganism did not remain in an explicit identifiable brand that we're all Roman pagans, so we follow the Roman pagan system. That no longer exists, so I don't think that's coming back. It's kind of funny to me, actually, to see people trying to revive Roman paganism in that way. It seems to me to be sillier than trying to revive Christianity for the reasons I've just laid out. But yeah, they're obviously not all of the Jews converted to Christianity, and people consider themselves Jewish today. Judaism itself has had many revolutions. The Reformed Jewish movement in the 19th century was a revolution with mass conversions. That, basically 90% of the Jewish population converted to Reform Judaism in the span of a couple decades after being quote-unquote Orthodox for thousands of years. That's pretty incredible. I think we're going to have to blame Napoleon for that one. I think that was one of Napoleon's most lasting impacts. And he was, of course, not the sole author of that decision. There are many other participants in his edicts concerning the, I don't know if it was it the liberation? I'm not sure. Emancipation, the emancipation of the Jewish people is what they called it. It's very interesting to think about the fact that, one of the most incredible religious revolutions in Judaism for thousands of years was enacted or orchestrated by a non-Jew named Napoleon Bonaparte. Again, it's not as if he wasn't also in contact with various members of the Jewish community. So we can't oversimplify things too much, but it is interesting to think about. In any case, yeah, what do we do? Are we just going to go back? I mean, clearly, again, my point is some Jews have maintained loyalty to the Jewish brand, and they say we're still Jews, even if in some way their Judaism would be unrecognizable to their predecessors. There is an evolution there where they maintain a consistency of identity, or at least a perceived consistency of identity, that many people have attacked. Many people have said this consistency is not real, but nonetheless, the members of the group feel that they are part of a real lineage, a real heritage. And I think many Christians will do that as well. Many Christians will adhere to the lineage of Christianity and say what was started 2,000 years ago will continue for another 2,000 years, or however long it takes for Jesus to come back in his second coming. That's when the religious revolution, that will be the next religious revolution for them. But I think what we're seeing for the vast majority of people is they're either languishing in confusion, or they're joining wokeism, which is itself very confusing. And we're seeing conservatism as an attempt to codify wokeism from behind. It's almost like if you ever see those construction crews where the guy in front is sort of laying down the cement, and then the guy in back of him is like patting down the cement. That's kind of how I think of it, that you've got certain ideologues who are boldly going forth and saying, this is what we believe, this is the newest revolutionary idea. And then you have the conservatives behind them saying, actually, we're the true champions of minorities and gay rights and whatever. And that is hegemonic, and that is dominant. And the philosophical question is still relevant, even if you try to get above all this and say, well, I'm not going to be involved in any of these things. I'm just a confused person. I'm not going to join any side. I'm going to be neutral. I'm going to stand above it all. I think you still have this basic question of good and evil, what to do with your life, how to view things, because it impacts you. It impacts you, the way that you think of the world, your deontology, your metaphysics. It all impacts your day-to-day ability to get out of the head. Get out of your head, get out of bed, get out of the house. Don't be a louse. Get going, get moving. Move your mind, move your body. It all, the beliefs that we have impact our actions, they impact our emotions, they impact our suffering, right? Our belief about the nature of good and evil has a huge impact on how we feel. Our beliefs are real. They have a real sensation attached to them. They cause more pleasure or pain than physical reality. And that, you see, what's interesting to me is different forms of abuse. Some people, the Marquis de Sade started a movement which identified physical abuse with pleasure. But at the same time, you have women, and maybe men too, but you have women who say things like, I don't like the way he looked at me. It made me uncomfortable the way that he did this or that. And the problem there isn't a problem of physical pain. Sometimes there's no physical interaction at all. The problem there is of mental, spiritual, emotional pain. So what do you do about that? You have to recognize that this is important. And for my part, where I'm at in all this, me personally, is I identify this kind of nihilism with darkness and absence and silence and a total loss of the personality. That in the dissolution of the knowledge of good and evil, in the dissolution of the body, mind, spirit, soul, in this confusion, in this chaos, everything reduces to nothing. Nothing is real, nothing is meaningful. Everything's reduced to darkness, and that I'm absent, that I'm alienated, I'm disconnected. And no one will remember me, and none of my actions will count, none of them will matter, there's no coherence. And so I try to get to the heart and the core of what I think is the issue. What is the problem when you don't have knowledge of good and evil? What does the world look like? It's not fire and brimstone. It's not slavery. It's this complete absence. It's this Sheol. It's this Hades. It's this darkness. It's death, total, utter, complete death. This is what the ancients believed prior to the vision of fiery hell brought in by Christ, the gnashing of teeth. You know, and I try to perfectly bring this into my consciousness as Christ descended into hell and confronted that. I try to perfectly meditate on it and really get to the heart of what it is, rather than the particulars of, oh, if this happens, I'll lose this. If this happens, I'll lose that. We particularize our fear. You'll find that women bring up the concept of serial killers and kidnappers and human traffickers, and those things exist. But they will use those as externalizations of a fear of rejection, a fear of discomfort, fears that are much more emotional than are physical. And so what I try to do is I try to distill all the particular fears of life into their most universal conception. And I try to really directly confront that and sort of dwell in it and absolutize it and be like, okay, I've reached this point where all the particular fears of life, the fear of not having the tribe, the community, the family, connection, love, friends, all the loss of all those things, not being significant, being small, universally small, infinitely small, the problem of calculus that the Greeks did not recognize, the problem, the Faustian spirit which leads to this questioning of good and evil, that leads us to the point of nothingness. So I try to really get down into the deepest level of Hades that's possible, which is what the hero Aeneas does, and others in Greco-Roman mythology. They go down to the deepest level of Hades and they confront the monsters there. The abyss is what Nietzsche called it. And once I feel that I've sufficiently driven myself deep enough into this geography of despair, into this universe of blackness, I then imagine what would be necessary for salvation from this once I've reached this deepest pit of silence and unimportance and meaninglessness. What would be required to defeat such a thing? Because clearly there's no moral, or I shouldn't say moral, there's no mortal, there's no material, a teacup couldn't do it, an elephant couldn't do it, a universe couldn't do it. There's nothing physical that could overcome this, the loss of meaning. There's nothing that could really defeat this. There's no thing that could defeat this. And so when I meditate on how absolutely devastating this would be, and I imagine, what could it be? What is there, maybe there's no hope. You want to say there's no hope, fine. Maldoror is instructive in the development of this type of meditation. But if there was such a thing that could overcome this deepest, darkest idea, what would that thing be? What would it look like? It would be beyond the material. It would be beyond the physical. It would be infinite in scope. It would be an infinity beyond infinity. It would be something that could defeat infinite death, defeat infinite darkness. It would be the point of light that emerges from nowhere, without cause, without reason, without logic, and overcomes all of this and says that despite the suffering, despite the question of good and evil, despite the confusion, despite the nihilism, despite the meaningless, despite all of that which seems totally insurmountable, this quagmire, this Gordian knot, it just cuts right through it. It's this piercing beam of light, the sword of Michael that just completely cuts right through it, pierces the darkness without any reason, without any justification. It's a goodness without justification. It doesn't have any, it does not need any reason for being. It doesn't need any, it's not reliant on anything else. It is the fundamental grounding. It is the fundamental, the ungrounded ground. And it completely overwhelms the darkness, and it gives us a meaning. It gives us a yes rather than a no. It gives us an affirmation. It says, why not? It says, yeah, you know, you may not understand life. You may not have a reason. You may not have meaning. You may not have any of these things. And you may see that attaching yourself to dead ideologies or dead religions or things of the past or whatever, you may see the flaws in that. You may see the ungroundedness in that. But nonetheless, you know, if there was such a force that could overcome all of that, what would that look like? And meditate on that. Meditate on those two opposites, the two opposites of the mind, the total darkness and the total light. And I think sometimes people get stuck in the total darkness and they become cynical. And I think sometimes people find the total light in superficialities and things that, I mean, you cannot represent that total light in a material sense. Nothing in this world is eternal. Everything in this world is flawed and lame. Frankly, everything, as Ivan the Heathen once said, everything is cringe. You know, everything in this world is cringe. Everything you try to do, everything you attempt. And I just thought that was he was talking, I think, more politically, but I think just metaphysically, morally, spiritually, that video connected with me very deeply. Everything is cringe. Everything is cynical. Everything is Machiavellian. Everyone offering you a solution, a reason to live, a meaning in life is coming from a flawed place. There's always some logical fallacy you can find to say, that's not grounded, that's not justified, you're just making that up, that's wishful thinking, you're afraid of death, you're just trying to control me, you're taking the concept of God and you're specifying that into I should tithe to your church, I should listen to your politics or whatever. We realize the superficiality of it. And so that, to me, I guess, this universal yes, this kind of salvation, to me, is what allows me to say, okay, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say why not. I'm going to say I don't have some, answer to you that's explainable. I don't have some logical reason why you should be alive and why you should fight for your life and why you should fight for the good over the bad. I don't really have that for you, and I don't think I could ever give that to you. I could try, but would I ever really succeed? Maybe not. But if there was such a thing, then I meditate on that. And the image of that, the feeling of that, that to me seems right. That to me seems like it gives us what we need. That's where I'll leave it. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye-bye. Nice.
Subscribe. Very good.
Nice. Beautiful.
Very good.
Beautiful. You're going to love it. If you love autism, you're going to love my channel. Okay, great.
All right.